My name is Bark Swislaki. I'm in the history program at NYU Abu Dhabi, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. It's also a pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Professor Jorge Flores, Professor of the History of European Colonial and Post-Colonial Systems of the European University Institute. When my colleagues and I here in the NYU Abu Dhabi History Program began to think about people we might bring in to speak at the Institute, Professor Flores came to my mind immediately. Our program was trying to think of ways of sharing with you some of the distinctive features of our program and what we're doing at NYU Abu Dhabi, which I just want to identify very briefly for you so that you too can understand why we hope to learn and what we hope to learn from Professor Flores with you tonight. History, as our program description tells us, is the study of human experience considered in relation to time and place. It is also a method of thinking characterized by its attention to the contexts in which people live and work. Students, and we tell our students this, students of history enter into an exciting world of debates about how best to understand past human experience. And the history major at NYU Abu Dhabi is designed to rethink and revise conventional features of the discipline. One of the ways that we do this is by rethinking and revising what we think of as the geography of the historical discipline. Most history programs around the world, if you've ever signed up for a history class in a college curriculum, have been organized around things you'll be familiar with from other parts of your life as well. The ideas of nation states, of civilizations, or so-called area studies areas. So we have courses on US history, French history, Chinese history, or maybe Asian civilization or Latin American history. Our program is trying something else, an experiment in respatializing history through a model of ocean systems, which we identify as 4 long-standing zones of human interaction and imagination. These 4 are going to be familiar to you. We did not invent the ocean systems. The Indian Ocean world, which we'll hear quite a bit about tonight, the Atlantic world, the Asia-Pacific world, and the Mediterranean. Now, many universities have programs in 1 or 2 of these models, and you can find courses probably at most in 1 or 2. Our program is unique in that it's organized almost entirely around these ocean systems, and it's through these systems that we try to teach our students about the world, rather than through the nation states, the notions of civilizations, and the traditionally defined area studies. Now, this ocean system model should not be mistaken for simply maritime history. That is, we don't only pay attention to what happens across oceans, but it's a way of exploring through an experimental model a new kind of framework to see what might come into view that we can't see through our old frameworks of nation states, civilizations, and area studies as they're conventionally defined. We are ourselves uncertain about how well this model will work. We're thinking about it. We feel like it works well some parts of the world, not so well maybe for other parts of the world. And part of what we're doing here with our speaker is asking someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about one of these ocean systems to share his expertise to help us think through what we're doing, how well it works, and where we might need to do something differently. And thus we turn to our speaker tonight, Professor Jorge Flores, who's been working in and around, through and beyond the history of the Indian Ocean region for much of his professional career, as just a brief survey that I'll give you here will indicate. His research focuses most generally on the political, social, and cultural history of the Portuguese Empire during the early modern period. His first major work, The Portuguese and the Sea of Ceylon, Trade, Diplomacy, and War. I hope I've translated, that's my first translation from Portuguese ever, I hope I got it right, was a study of the maritime history of the central Indian Ocean. It was also, quite intriguingly for our purposes of thinking about what we're doing, a study of the commercial, political, and social networks shaping the Sea of Ceylon, which was itself, I believe, as Professor Flores was exploring, a new geohistorical concept that he developed in this book. He later worked for a period of time at the University of Macau in the early 1990s, where he took an interest in that more eastern end of the Portuguese Empire in maritime Asia, conducting research on 16th to 17th century Macau and Sino-Portuguese relations with a focus on what he called political mechanisms, intelligence, ritual and protocol, the role of interpreter-translators, and the social dimensions of political communication. He has since moved back west to the social and political communication between the Portuguese Estado de India, the Mughal Empire, and the Deccan Sultanates in the 16th to 17th centuries, paying particular attention to the interface between political developments around Goa and the Portuguese European representations of the Mughals. We have then seen someone start in the central Indian Ocean, move outside of that sphere of influence, yet in a connection shaped by the Portuguese Empire, and then back up to the western side of India, moving in and through this ocean region. And tonight he's going to speak, I think, on some of the motion between these different parts, and I welcome you to a talk with Professor Flores on the topic. Oh, it's not up there, it's here. From Hormuz to Malacca, circa 1600, the world of port cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with such a huge crowd. It's not very common for people in, at least in my academic world, so it's a very positive surprise. Thank you for coming. And I'm very grateful for the invitation, which was first conveyed by Mark, but involved, I think, all the history program and the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. It's my first time here, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present my work to a very diverse audience. I'll have a second lecture tomorrow for a less diversified audience, where some of the things that I'll say today will be developed along the lines of what Mark just said, how to think in terms of different cultural zones and interaction of different cultural zones in a place like the Indian Ocean, which moves us away from the nation-state paradigm and from many other paradigms. I was actually trained I never did Portuguese history, although I'm a Portuguese historian. I was trained as what classically is called in Portuguese universities, history of the Portuguese discoveries and expansion. We have similar developments for example, in Leiden Center for Expansion in the 1980s, 1990s, when this happened. Now things have different names. I think people knew different things by now. And I was lucky to find and to talk to and to become part of a younger generation by now, who had very close interactions with big names of people doing Indian Ocean studies. People like Chaudhry, people like Om Prakash, Kenneth McPherson, Sanjay Subramaniam, Ashin Dasgupta, many historians from India, from Australia, also from Europe, from the United States. And I learned a lot from them since I took the first course on the history of the Indian Ocean in 1987, if I'm not mistaken, which was not that common in Portuguese universities by then. So in a way, my work today, which is a sort of overview of this world, actually there were two titles. There was a longer title, and then I was advised to give a more flashy one, and this is more smaller one, which I think is more synthetic and easier to get the attention to. It's a combination of an overview of this world and Portuguese interaction in these places. And I think perhaps you are more acquainted with the world itself and less acquainted with the Portuguese intervention and interaction in the area. And I'll show you some of the 16th, 17th century drawings and pictures, Portuguese pictures of the period to give you a sense of what was going on. And as I said, in a way, my work and my presentation today reflects a bit that kind of conversation and dialogue with a number of very interesting people. And I would perhaps underline the importance of two French historians. One, both died in 1998 with 2 weeks of difference. One was Jean Aubin, who wrote a lot on the Persian Gulf, late medieval, early modern, according to sort of Western standards of chronology. And he worked, I have to put this on. he did a seminal article on the kingdom of Hormuz in the early 16th century. It's a very long article, the way the French do it, with a lot of footnotes. And it's really still, I think it's only French edition, there's no English translation of that. It's really one of the best works on the topic. The other one was Denis Lombard, who worked a lot on Southeast Asia. First was trained as a Chinese scholar, then became a Southeast Asian scholar. And he has, apart from one book on the island of Java as a sort of crossroads of insular Southeast Asia, he wrote 2 or 3 very interesting articles on port cities. And in a way, also my work reflects a bit of that kind of work. Perhaps we should start by looking at the maps themselves. This is sort of to get the geography. The 2 straits, as we call them, Red Sea, Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, including, of course, Eastern Africa, a number of Western Indian areas which will be important to consider, and then the Bay of Bengal in sort of strong and close dialogue especially with insular Southeast Asia, which is more or less today's Indonesia, with Malacca, which is in the next map that I want to show you, and a bit the connections with the South China Sea. So my talk won't be specifically about the 1600s. It will cover the period from 1500 to 1650, more or less, when the kind of Portuguese involvement that was going on for 1.5 centuries really changed after the 1650s. And so we should consider that larger chronology instead of the 1600s. And see what you see here is the way we move east and the way actually the Portuguese Empire progressed to east with a number of port cities, very important port cities of the period, where the Portuguese were involved, and you see the subtitles there with major official Portuguese settlements and other settlements, and you see them in the Indian subcontinent, the Bay of Bengal, and across what is today Indonesia, and what Denis Lombard coined as the Southeast Asian Mediterranean, and actually there's an article on the Southeast Asian Mediterranean. So these port cities, as I'll try to present them, have a number of sort of markers and features which are crucial to understand the early modern period in this area. And in many ways, I think they connect well with what is going on in many of these places today in the 20th and 21st century. We think of them with scarce territory and dependence on maritime trade, with multi-ethnic places, with multilingual societies, with a variety of models for the accommodation of rather diverse populations, with a plastic conception of the urban space with few rigid boundaries or barriers, where flexibility, negotiation, adaptation, and mobility, both to move from one port to the other or to create new ports, are one of the stronger features of this world. And also one can, in a way, draw a comparison between early modern commercial diasporas and what is going on today in terms of diaspora. So in many ways, I would say that you have a generation of port cities which interest me, from the 15th, even before, but I try to coincide with European presence in this world, 15th to 18th centuries, and then you have a new generation which develops over the 19th century with Singapore, with Hong Kong, up to today with places like Abu Dhabi, for example. It's a good example of, I think, as a newcomer, I just arrived 2 days ago, but I see some of the features that I see in my port cities of the 16th, 17th century reflected in Abu Dhabi and other places that I know well, Hong Kong and Singapore, today, for example. So I would like to keep that in mind, which I think it's a useful comparison and a sort of useful bridge between the two worlds also in terms of chronology. So I'll read my text, and I hope not to go beyond the schedule and to keep the time. When the Portuguese entered the Indian Ocean in 1498, the region was at the height of its so-called Age of Commerce. It is a term coined by Anthony Reid, who is an Australian scholar of Southeast Asia. The Portuguese faced a high degree of commercial and cultural sophistication and were not truly prepared to deal with such reality. During his formal reception by the Samudri Raja on the last day of May of 1498, after being warned by two prominent Muslim officials that the gift he had brought, and I quote from a Portuguese source of that period, was not a thing to offer a king, Vasco da Gama, and I'll show you the face, but also because I'm Vasco da Gama professor in the place where I work, so I should introduce you to the sort of a picture in his older age, housed in the Museum of Ancient Art in Lisbon. Vasco da Gama was forced to listen to the ruler of Calicut bitterly declare in front of a large group of courtiers that Gama, and I quote again from the same source, came from a very rich kingdom and yet had brought him nothing. And actually it was nothing. Besides some clothes, the gift consisted of 4 strings of coral, a case containing 6 wash hand basins, a case of sugar, 2 casks of oil, and 2 avani. So it's nothing that the Raja of Calicut would be impressed with. This feverish mercantile and maritime activity derived in large measure from the expansion of Islam in Asia, which particularly shaped the continent's coastal areas in the closing centuries of the first millennium, and again from the 13th to the 15th centuries. Especially during the latter period, communities of Muslim merchants established themselves along the littoral societies of the Indian Ocean, especially in South and Southeast Asia. Such communities were responsible for the variety of commercial networks throughout the region, as well as for the spread of the port city, specifically the Sultanate, as a political and economic model. Many modern scholars see the creation of Islamic world economy as inaugurating a new phase in the history of the Indian Ocean. Their studies on this subject reflect a belief that Islam brought about a radical break with the past. This position is somewhat reductive. Indeed, it is as problematic to speak of an Islamic era in maritime Asia as it is to assert a Vasco da Gama era, which it was also very common to do in the 1950s, 1960s for this region. While the arrival of Islam doubtlessly constituted a key moment in the history of the Indian Ocean, there are numerous problems associated with the concept of an Islamic era. For example, the consecration of Islam as defining force minimizes other identities in the region for merchant communities and other coastal groups. Be as it may, this period in Asian maritime commerce was strongly influenced by the spice trade. The European search for spices after 1500 earned the trade such prominent role in the relevant historiography that Indian or South Asian, mostly commercial history, during the early modern era tends to be considered synonymous with the production and circulation of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. In fact, a seemingly infinite number of other goods were transported and traded across maritime Asia during this period, linking well-known oceanic trade routes to smaller regional and local commercial networks. The long and eclectic list includes textiles, ivory, rice, horses, elephants, pearls, precious stones, carpets, illuminated manuscripts, and luxury furniture, among many others. A detailed study of any of the above-mentioned commodities invariably would show that trade in maritime Asia was hardly static, with regular shifts in consumer tastes and markets, leading to frequent changes in the goods offered for sale, as well as in the hierarchy of port cities. See, for example, the case of coffee, whose increasing consumption in the Ottoman and Safavid empires around the turn of the 17th century helps to explain the concurrent rise of the Yemeni port of Mocha. Beyond its immediately economic dimension, this exchange of goods had cultural implications as well. Trade gives a society access to goods from other cultures and thus inevitably molds people's daily lives, affects their tastes, and creates interesting opportunities for cultural exchange. There are innumerable examples of forms of dress, habits, and artistic values and modes of production successively migrating from one culture to another. In Hormuz, for example, and we'll speak again about Hormuz, one could see sacred cows wandering through the streets, much as they would in any city in India, as well as people chewing betel as they would in Calicut in the same period. In Narai, the ruler of the Buddhist kingdom of Siam, who reigned between 1656 and 88, dressed in the Iranian fashion, influenced by the Persian presence in his kingdom, refusing to wear a turban solely because he found it uncomfortably heavy. The Portuguese quickly inserted themselves into the diversity of production and consumption habits that was maritime Asia and contributed significantly to the richness of the region. while in 1498 Vasco da Gama was concerned with the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope in pursuit of spices, just a few years later, by 1509, the governor Afonso de Albuquerque, who is also well known, was attempting to carve out a place for the Portuguese in inter-Asian commerce. The trade is suggestively described from India to India, which became in Anglo-Saxon books today country trade, where Europeans trade within maritime Asia circuits without thinking about specifically about the connections between the Indian Ocean and Europe itself. Gaining control of Goa in 1510, and this is one of some of the 17th century maps of Goa. This is a possibility to show you. And also this is a view of Goa in 1595 as depicted by a Dutch traveler who actually worked for the Portuguese before the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was created in 1602. His name is Lin Schoten. Maybe many of you are acquainted with his very interesting drawings of, and then becoming engravings in Holland in the early 17th century. Gaining control of Goa, which became the capital city of the so-called State of India, or Estado de India, in Hormuz in 1515, Albuquerque tried his hand and the trade in horses between the Persian Gulf, tried his hand at the trade in horses between the Persian Gulf and India, as lucrative as the spice trade, if not more so. With the conquest of Malacca in 1511, the Portuguese took control of the most successful port of insular Southeast Asia. And I'll show you again a Portuguese map, Portuguese plan of Malacca of the 17th century. A truly cosmopolitan place where one could hear 70 different languages being spoken every day. And this is the colorful, perhaps exaggerated assessment of Tomé Pires, a Portuguese traveler who wrote around 1515. And it actually, his account is there's an English translation of his account. The city mastered the navigation and commerce through the Straits of Malacca and was able to link the South China Sea trade to the Mediterranean markets via a number of affluent intermediaries, namely the Gujaratis, and we'll speak again about the traders from Gujarat in northwestern India. Malacca harbored diverse trading communities regardless of ethnic origin and belief, and therefore stand as a social and religious tolerant port city. In the early years, the Portuguese tried and to a certain extent succeeded not to damage such environment. But at the turn of the 17th century, and especially on the eve of the Dutch conquest of the city in 1641, Malacca was little more than a Portuguese military outpost. So in 1.5 centuries, it changed from the most important sultanate in Southeast Asia to a place where there was a Portuguese fortress, a very monolithic place, so to say, with no social diversity and not very interesting from an ethnic point of view too, and also from a commercial point of view. The commercial wealth and social diversity, meanwhile, moved to other neighboring ports and polities like Dutch Batavia, and which became the headquarters of the VOC in Asia, and this is a later 18th century plan of Batavia. Or especially the Sultanate of Aceh. There was for people doing Southeast Asian history, there was a strong rivalry between the Sultanate of Aceh, which in a way fostered all the anti-Catholic sentiments of the region against the Portuguese who were based in Malacca. So Aceh became stronger because the Portuguese controlled Malacca. Otherwise, it would be a sultanate like many others in the region. And this is a Portuguese plan of Aceh. So Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz, and the three places were controlled by the Portuguese between 1510 and 1515, constituted a sort of three-legged stool conceived in the early 16th century by the Portuguese, or a four-legged chair if we are to include the port city of Macau, which was where the Portuguese established themselves around 1557. However, this world changed considerably by the mid-17th century after the loss of Hormuz to an Anglo-Safavid League in 1622, and the capture of Malacca by a Dutch Johor, which was another sultanate in the region, alliance in 1641. There are many examples of Portuguese intervention in the regional economy that, while not considerably relevant to the financial and commercial situation of the so-called Estado de India, were nonetheless particularly important where cross-cultural trade was concerned. Officials purchasing Indian coverlets or tortoise shell caskets, and adventurers wearing earrings and dressing in the Muslim fashion are cases in point. As recent arrivals to the region, the Portuguese were one of several groups of clients in the dynamic commercial environment of the Indian Ocean, acquiring and circulating a wide range of objects that often took on new forms, meanings, and functions once in European hands. The early Indian Ocean was a space marked by unceasing mobility, with the movement of peoples and the spreading of religions complementing the exchange of goods. The networks that spread Theravada Buddhism throughout maritime Asia were not merely routes of religious expansion, but also axes of ideological, political, cultural, and material identity and proximity, as evidenced by the intense maritime contact between the Buddhist kingdoms of Sri Lanka, for example, and those of continental Southeast Asia in the same period. As for Islam, the massive pilgrimages of Muslims to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina resulted in cyclical ocean-going voyages of thousands of people, which utterly transformed the Indian Ocean world. Our reference to the Ajis compels us to take a closer look at the groups that gave life to the Indian Ocean during the early modern period. Not always understood or underscored by historians, these groups were true workers of the sea, making a living exclusively from the ocean and the opportunities it furnished. As the Portuguese called them, notaques, operated in the Persian Gulf and were set to sail, and I quote from the Portuguese source of the mid-16th century, which I'll show you in a minute, to sail the sea, thieving all the way. This is a very interesting book, which is today housed in a Rome library, and apparently was commissioned. It's sort of visual description of Asia, most probably mid-16th century, commissioned by an anonymous Portuguese to local painters, local artists. And it starts with East Africa and stops in China. There's no Japan. The Portuguese arrived in Japan in 1543, so most probably it's before that. And it's very interesting in terms of sort of ethnographical depiction or vision of a Portuguese, mixed vision of a Portuguese and local artists in this period. And this is, for example, where he speaks about piracy in the Persian Gulf and how these people were important and very dangerous for the Portuguese who were based by then in Hormuz. And he calls them, in the Portuguese subtitle, he calls them thieves. The Sidis or Apshis coming from Ethiopia were Indians of African origin, as I said, originally from Abyssinia, who controlled parts of the Konkan and Gujarat coasts in the west coast of India from fortresses such as Danda and Janjira, and they have a sort of very important presence, also political and commercial presence in many polities of the Indian subcontinent. The Malay world was home to the Orang Laut, sea gypsies who made their living by exploiting the many resources of the Straits of Malacca, including piracy, and the Bugis, a group of South Sulawesi, whose maritime expansion acquired a notable dimension during the last decades of the 17th century. In addition to Muslim pilgrims, there were merchants and merchant pilgrims who used the same ships and ports to transport their goods. The constant movement of traders in the Indian Ocean, with its attendant ethnic variety, has constituted a privileged topic for historians. In looking at the history of the Indian Ocean, it has been possible to chart the various mercantile diasporas that affected the region. The idea of a commercial diaspora, however, is not without controversy. Diaspora implies, most of the time, the complete autonomy of a merchant community removed from the control of state or the lack of state, which we know has infrequently been the case. Among the groups that prospered in the early modern Indian Ocean were the Gujaratis, who operated in all maritime Asia's important ports as merchants and ship owners. A forgotten telesocracy, as one French historian accurately described them, this often neglected group was composed of Ismailis, Parsis, and Banyas, and expertly constructed a mosaic of commercial relationships from the Red Sea to the Far East. Another group comprised the Muslim merchants from South India, who frequently acted as the Gujaratis' commercial partners. Muslim colonies located in southern India, like the Pardeshis, Muslims from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, which the Portuguese identify as Moors from Mecca, as everyone was coming from Mecca, were active in long-distance maritime trade and lived part of the year in Kerala, the southwestern coast of India. The Maplas of Malabar, the same region, brought together local and regional trade networks, both of which they dominated and linked them to the Pardeshis' long-distance trade. Of course, the prominence of the Gujaratis and the Moplas should not cause us to forget the many other mercantile groups that operated in the region. Among these are the Armenians, who, unlike other merchant groups, had a substantial impact on maritime trade and land-based trade beginning in the 1600s, or the Shulias, Kellings, and Chettis, mostly based in the coast of Coromandel, that is the eastern coast of India, with Malacca and the ports of the Bay of Bengal constituting their principal markets. And if one is interested in drawing comparisons between the Western Indian Ocean and other areas of maritime Asia, it becomes imperative to look east and consider the emigration of Chinese throughout Southeast Asia, which was well underway by the early Ming Dynasty. In most cases, an individual or community's economic strength led to the acquisition of political influence, creating an interesting coupling of commerce and power, compatible with what historians like Sanjay Subramaniam and Chris Bailey define as the portfolium capitalism. Frequently, these commercial and political magnates exercise the third function, that of artistic and cultural patron. Individuals and groups with political, military, commercial, and financial skills moved from place to place in the Indian Ocean and easily found jobs in foreign societies, even those of a different religion. Throughout early modern maritime Asia, there was an active market for foreign elites with these skills. One could profit from one's expertise independently of ethnic origin, social background, or religious belief. The main goal was to secure the collaboration of those who were most capable, whether in war, diplomacy, governance, or trade. It is precisely this phenomenon, quite common in the many states in early modern Asia with multi-ethnic decision-making structures, that explains how the Habshis, the ones coming from Ethiopia, came to occupy a place in the inner circles of India's principal rulers during this period. However, how the Chinese, if you go again to try a comparison with other parts of maritime Asia, how the Chinese frequently exercise important political functions in various Southeast Asian sultanates, and how the Persians built an empire of influence throughout maritime Asia. The Portuguese managed to considerably contribute to this interesting phenomenon, as many merchants, adventurers, and even renegades became political, financial, and military advisors of different rulers, either Muslim or Buddhist or even Hindus, especially in the Bay of Bengal area and Southeast Asia. Think of a man called Yog Veloso in late 16th century Cambodia, who is really a sort of one of the principal main advisors of the local king, or the Portuguese mestizo born in Macau, was a cannon founder named João de Cruz, and his influence in mid-17th century Vietnam. Other relevant examples are those of the renegade Fernão Caldeira, resident in the port of Masulipatam, was controlled by the Sultanate of Golconda in the eastern coast of India, or the merchant adventurer Francisco Vieira de Figueiredo was studied by someone who did a lot in terms of the Portuguese Empire, a British scholar, first military official and then historian called Charles Boxer, who was, this Francisco Vieira de Figueiredo was rather close to the Sultan of Makassar in Southeast Asia and controlled a private network of trade and influence stretching from the eastern coast of India to Macau between the 1620s and the 1660s. The careers of the various traders and magnates of maritime Asia cannot be properly understood without an examination of the ports where these men lived and conducted business. The Indian Ocean of the 16th and 17th centuries was a region of port cities which acted as economic engines and whose importance varied according to their geostrategic location and other political cultural factors. Despite the economic strength of these cities, they were vulnerable to all types of unpredictable events. For example, like any other living organism, the cities were exposed to innumerable sources of geographic transformation. The silting of a harbor could signal the death of a prosperous port, and this occurred in the River Ganges Delta port called Satgun in western Bengal, or in Tata in Sindh. And this could either destroy a port or help launch the fortune of a neighboring settlement. This happened a lot in the Indian Ocean area throughout the period. There are also, in my view, considerable advantages to think about Portuguese and other European port cities in Asia as organic, somewhat biological identities. A particular set of circumstances explain why they were born at some point. Other circumstances shaped the way they grew and competed with neighbors and rivals. And the third set of reasons may have eventually led to their death at some point, like Malacca and Hormuz, who were prominent places in the early 16th century and disappeared in the mid-17th century. Some were just stillbirths, projects of port cities that someone fostered at a particular moment, but were never able to really fly. The creation of a replica of Macau, and now I show you again a 17th century Portuguese plan of Macau. The creation of a replica of Macau in Cambodia, implying the transfer of the entire population, as suggested in 1704 by the local king through the influential Portuguese merchant called Nicolau de Fiumes, is a relevant example and shows how the competition among port cities and the need to attract investment in a skillful way worked in those days. And I give you a sort of loose translation to English from the Portuguese contemporary document, which, by the way, consists of a translation from Khmer. Considering the calamities that the Portuguese settlers of the noble city of Macau suffer, the King of Cambodia graciously offers them the possibility to live free from oppression in any part of his reign, and is willing to give them land so that they can cultivate it, and will equally give them the right to buy and sell all sorts of commodities of this kingdom, as well as build ships and send them to any port. We will also grant them permission to build a fortress, and to this end we will provide both materials and manpower. So it's very interesting because if you know a bit about the history of Macau, you know that from the Ming-Qing transition, moving to the second half of the 17th century, there's a lot of pressure from Qing emperors towards the sort of commercial activity and political autonomy of the city. And at some point, other polities like the Kingdom of Cambodia were saying, if you are not happy there, perhaps you could move here, and you have special conditions to do so. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, in my view. In many cases, Indian Ocean ports developed into city-states that gained control of neighboring ports and became centers of true maritime empires. These cities were cosmopolitan, culturally tolerant places, known for the intermingling of large, fluctuating populations composed of individuals from different religions, religious, linguistic, ethnic, and national backgrounds. Such training centers acted as microcosms of the cultural interactions that took place in the wider Asian world, anchored coastal societies that, despite their differences, were united by a set of common interests and similar ways of life. As spaces of rapid economic flexibility, they pioneered the development of maritime law and port regulations in Asia, and this is the case of Malacca, for example, necessary conditions for attracting merchants, increasing the number of transactions that took place locally, and extracting valuable custom duties. The same paradigm was at work in Eastern African port cities, which from the 10th century had experienced successive waves of emigration from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and became sites for the successful grafting of Arab and Persian elements onto a Bantu cultural background. By the end of the 15th century, there were 30 to 40 of these port cities, many of which acted as true laboratories of Swahili culture. The most important were Malindi, Mombasa, Kilwa, and Sofala, due to their better harbors and networks. The close relations between the Swahili coast and maritime Asia have led some scholars like Chandra da Silva, someone doing especially history of Sri Lanka in this period, to subvert hierarchies and speak of an Afrasian Sea instead of the Arabian Sea, or an African Sea rather than the Indian Ocean. Ports like Aden and Hormuz, and this is a mid-16th century French map or Portuguese map then worked by French cartographers, 1547, the so-called Valar Atlas, showing from land to sea the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. And then a Portuguese 17th century plan of Hormuz. Basically, it's the same kind of plans that I've shown you for other cities, port cities controlled by the Portuguese. Aden and Hormuz dominated maritime commerce in the Middle East, respectively controlling the entrance to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Strategic maritime location, however, was not the only advantage held by these and other commercial nodes in the straits. They also linked maritime and overland trade routes between the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, connected shipping to caravans, and served as ports of call for both pilgrims and merchants. while Jeddah was central to those completing the Hajj via the Red Sea, Basra was strategically placed along the route of pilgrims traveling from Safavid Iran to the holy cities of Islam. Aden was in command of the coast of Yemen, Hadramaut, and Eritrea, and as the key to the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, it was frequented by ships from all over Asia. Understandably, Aden was perpetually on the mind of the region's powers, who imposed high taxes on the city's trade. Aden was essential to anyone who sought to control the Western Indian Ocean. The Portuguese, however, failed to take the city and were unable to transform the island of Socotra, nearby. Between 1507 and 1511, they tried to do so, into a sort of second Aden. The Ottomans were more successful, capturing Aden in 1538 and using it as a launching pad for their imperial projects in maritime Asia, before they eventually discarded in the 1630s, favoring instead of the port of Mocha. And actually, there's a very interesting recent book on the Ottoman expansion in the sea by American historian called Giancarlo Casal. It's called The Ottoman Age of Exploration. It came 2 or 3 years ago by with Oxford University Press. Hormuz, and now I show you actually one of, going back to that Portuguese sort of visual grammar of Asia in the mid-16th century, a scene where the Portuguese in Hormuz are having dinner with their feet underwater because of the hot climate there. So this is a very interesting, one of the, I think, the most interesting depictions of this included in this book. Hormuz had 2 good ports, and its authority extended not only to the islands of the Gulf, but also to the coast of Oman and its cities. The customs house contributed to the fortune of the city that, as a contemporary Portuguese observer noted, the Persians considered the precious stone embedded in the ring of the world. Situated at the crossroads of the Iranian, Arab, and Indian worlds, Hormuz was thoroughly cosmopolitan, bringing together merchants from a variety of geographic and religious backgrounds. Arabs, Persians, Indians, Jews, and Christians interacted with each other, which elicited the severe criticism of Catholic missionaries during the 16th century. It's good. There were Catholic missionaries there, not really doing missionary work, but passing by, living in the city, trying to control and to assess how Catholics were the Portuguese once exposed to a different cultural and religious environment. And also there was a visit of the Portuguese Inquisition in the late 16th century. It is very different. They were so soft when compared with what the Inquisition was doing in Portugal. You see that they understood that they were in a very different environment, although of course they were condemning that kind of interaction, those kinds of interactions. The coast of the Indian subcontinent occupies an extensive area between the Indus and the Ganges rivers and was home to a series of port cities. Many played a major role in the history of the early modern Indian Ocean. I have a section here which I could expand, trying to point out the most important ones, but I think we can skip that for the sake of brevity and to keep time and to show how the Portuguese again interacted with these regions and what kind of social phenomenon of interaction one should perhaps stress at this point. In many of these ports, as well in Southeast Asia, the Portuguese established a strong informal presence made of a myriad of small coastal settlements, known in Portuguese as povoações, which means settlements, and bandeiras. And bandeiras, it's in plural, the singular is bandel, is perhaps a familiar word for you. It's bandar. It's the Persian word bandar, which the Portuguese adapted, sort of Portuguese corruption of the word, and became, has 2 meanings in 16th century or 17th century Portuguese. It means port, as in Persian, and it means a Portuguese community or settlement within a larger port. A port that the Portuguese do not control, but there's a Portuguese community in that. And this is something that the Portuguese applied, for example, to Thailand, which by then was called Siam. There was this big city called Ayutthaya, which was the capital city. And there was the Portuguese bandel in Ayutthaya, which is very important until the 18th century. And they use, again, the same word coming from the Persian Gulf. Such a string of informal colonies represents a shadow empire, and this is a term coined by an American historian called George Winius, or an improvised empire, which is the formula preferred by Sanjay Subramanian. which in a way corresponds to the reverse side of Goa, Goa being the official capital city of the Portuguese, and all these other places were sort of the other side of the coin of an official presence in the area. This alternative empire was comprised of adventurers and renegades and marked by trade and military skills, mixed marriages and blurred ethnic boundaries, cross-cultural dressing and food. Port cities like Nagapattinam in the south of India, the so-called Coromandel coast, or St. Thomas, or in Portuguese, São Tomé of Mylapore, where, according to tradition, there's the tomb of St. Thomas the Apostle. And Hooghly is in the sort of predecessor of Calcutta in the River Ganges Delta, where the Portuguese had a major presence until the mid-17th century. So all these places, and actually they were expelled from this place by the Mughals in 1632, and this is a Mughal miniature of the expulsion, the Mughal attack to Hooghly, and the expulsion of the Portuguese from the port in 1632, although they came back later on, and they were very close to what was going on in Calcutta later on in the 17th century. So all these places constituted crucial pieces of such puzzle. Further east, we have the importance we have the important Portuguese bandar of Ayutthaya, the one I mentioned, and numerous Portuguese kampongs, which means in Malay quarters, neighborhoods, in several ports of the Malay world. The Portuguese tribe, as Leonardo Andaya and other people like Stefan Alikovsky-Smith are working on, made of different components, became a Southeast Asian recognizable brand in this period. And again, very little to do with the Portuguese official structures that people from Lisbon and Goa were trying to establish in the region. In many ways, the arrival of the Portuguese signified the entry of one more group in a long, complex cast of characters pursuing different interests in the region, sometimes as competitors, in other instances as partners. This happened particularly in the microcosms of the most important river deltas where bands of sea gypsies abounded. So we find the Portuguese mixed with Turks and Muslims from Malabar, cruising the Indus Delta and resisting the Mughal conquest of Sindh in the late 16th century, for example. We also come across them roaming the Ganges Delta under the name of Armad, which is evidently a corruption of the Portuguese word armada, or fleet. Local poems often mention the Portuguese pirates in the region, while many local temples show terracotta paintings depicting Portuguese ships and sailors. They lived as pirates among pirates, taking advantage of the commercial strength of ports like Chittagong and controlling the intricate river channels that led to them. Just as in Sindh, they engaged in guerrilla opposition to the imperial authority, the Mughal imperial authority in Bengal, throughout the 17th century. The Farangian Armads are seen as a local tribe, and texts like the Baharistani-Gabi, penned by the Persian Mughal official Mirza Nathan, provide a clear picture of an interesting process of sort of Bengalization of the Portuguese in the region in the 17th century. So let's move on to, in a way, by try to assess the Portuguese impact in this world, and we'll move towards the conclusion of what I would like to say today, or present today. What impact did the Portuguese have on the Indian Ocean? Was it the mark of an empire that dominated and transformed, or of an empire concerned with integration and foundation? The answer, I think, is both. The state of India was the manifestation of an expansionist project developed by an early modern European state. It was written in the political and diplomatic language of legitimization through war and peace, but also was concerned with mechanisms of economic domination and social control. The officials in charge of the Portuguese Empire were quite willing to use violence either to persuade or to force others to submit. Within this context, the Portuguese managed, in certain regions and during defined time periods, to influence greatly circulation and trade within the Indian Ocean region, deploying armadas and granting safe conducts, which the Portuguese were calling them cartazes, to their allies, while denying them to their enemies. The empire established monopolies of commercial routes and commodities, blockaded ports and built fortresses, demanded tribute, the Portuguese word of the period was parias, and instituted old systems of vassalage, which were familiar to them since the late medieval period in Portugal and in other parts of Europe in the same period. Rupture, however, went hand in hand with continuity, as the impact of the Portuguese and other Europeans on the Indian Ocean prior to the 19th century was not as absolute as some would imply, whether they speak of an age of partnership or an age of contained conflict, and there are historians arguing in both directions. In contesting the theory of rupture, we should begin by examining the basis for the Europeans' purported exceptionalism by questioning whether the Portuguese impact on maritime Asia was really more profound or substantially different from that of earlier or contemporary non-European empires. Take, for example, the Ming expansion of the early 15th century, which imposed vassalage links throughout the region. Or consider the Ottomans, who were as invested as the Portuguese in discovering the Indian Ocean, going back to the book by Casale that I mentioned earlier. Like the state of India, the Ottoman Empire conquered coastal cities, deployed commercial agents, imposed monopolies, extracted custom duties, and managed to extend its political and military influence as far as Indonesia. There was a very strong political and military connection between Istanbul and the Sultanate of Aceh, the one I showed you before. Finally, ponder the relevance of the Omani thalassocracy. At the end of the 17th century and under the Ayubi dynasty, the Omanis extended as far as Kilwa after taking Pat and Mombasa in the late 17th century from the Portuguese. To avoid overstating the Portuguese influence, we must acknowledge that Portugal's Indian Ocean project was always dependent on local collaboration and relationships. And the newly arrived Europeans, the Portuguese and other Europeans, were not always the party that dictated the terms of the partnership. This was as true in trade as it was in politics, with the Portuguese interaction with local groups involving a mass of merchants, sailors, interpreters, and advisors. Take the example of Santa Maria do Monte, was a Portuguese ship that sailed between Goa and Hormuz as early as 1520. And it shows the importance of these workers of the sea, as I have termed them before. Of the 140 people on board, the Portuguese numbered no more than a dozen. And the Portuguese captain of the ship was actually Italian, and the vast majority of the crew was Muslim. The ship itself, which the Portuguese had confiscated before, was in less than good condition, so very far from the kind of image people have about sort of military mighty of the Portuguese, even in a very early period, the 1520s. The diverse nature of the empire itself explains much about the Portuguese activities in Asia, as well as their dependence on maritime workers. The empire was made of both viceroys and renegades, bureaucrats in Goa and adventurers in Chittagong, and the Estado de India and the Shadow Empire, the formal empire and an improvised empire. In short, the many facets of the Portuguese presence in the early modern Indian Ocean world do not lend themselves to linear analysis of impacts and responses. Portugal Asian Empire was built by others as much as by the Portuguese themselves. It constituted another, in a way, European Catholic stratum of life in the complex world of the Indian Ocean, contributing in turn to the urban, mercantile, social, and religious networks that characterized the region around 1500 and beyond. Portuguese involvement led to the decline of some ports, but it made others more prominent. The Portuguese brought more powerful ships and cannons to the Indian Ocean, but they quickly complemented these with local techniques and tools of war. They converted thousands to Christianity, though they also learned of the advantages of multi-ethnic societies. In an Indian Ocean more accustomed to incorporation than to expulsion, the Portuguese contributed to the region's mix of merchants, political magnates, pilgrims, travelers, and pirates, and other sea gypsies, constantly traveling through the seas of Asia. The reactions the Portuguese inspired among the Asians, with understandable variations from the Red Sea to China, effectively illustrates the region's difficult balancing act between impact and integration, which created the seemingly paradoxical condition of a group like the Portuguese appearing simultaneously strange and familiar. By way of conclusion, we will briefly consider some of these reactions. The maritime war with the infidels is the favorite topic of many Muslim-authored accounts about the Portuguese, with religion and the rhetoric of jihad featuring prominently in these texts. That said, most descriptions of the Portuguese written by Asians do not necessarily deal with the war of religions. Concentering on Portuguese control of the sea, these texts often have an anthropological flavor and usually are dedicated simply to describing what is exotic or culturally inferior about the Europeans. There are images of ships and cannons, armor and iron hats, bread and wine, Portuguese clothing and domesticated dogs, manners and hygiene, or rather the lack of thereof. The seemingly invincible Portuguese maritime empire was not immune to weaknesses, at least in the eyes of the Asian observers. Cristóvão Vieira, one of the captive members of the first Portuguese diplomatic mission to Beijing in the early 1520s, noted in Canton years later, in 1534, he was in a prison for more than about 15 years, that the Chinese described the Portuguese as, and I quote from his letter, like fish that if taken out of water or the sea, will quickly die. Nearly a century and a half later, in 1666, the governor of Guangdong, Chinese province, noted in an account of Macau, and I quote, that the Portuguese did not possess lands, and even if they did, they would not know how to cultivate them. On the other hand, there are certain Asian accounts of the Portuguese from which the idea of a European other does not make sense. For instance, some Chinese were said to believe that the Portuguese came from a land near Malacca, while others, so no idea of Europe in this sort of origin, while others thought that they were members of a Buddhist sect. And in Malacca, the Portuguese were taken for white Bengalis, so people coming from the ports of the river Ganges Delta, so they were white Bengalis, while the Japanese thought of them as Indians. These descriptions are signs of the sort of Asianization of the recently arrived Europeans, effectively illustrating the Indian Ocean's capacity for accommodating difference and categorizing the unfamiliar within the region's civilizing framework. Even more interesting and paradoxically are the frequent cases of Portuguese individuals in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia achieving the status of local deities, invested with magical powers and being worshipped, even as they were understood by locals to be strange and even hostile. And it's something that I will develop tomorrow in my seminar with the students. Constantino de Sá de Noronha was a Portuguese Captain General of Sri Lanka in the 1630s, was killed actually in combat in 1630, was worshipped as a deity thereafter, for example. And again, I will develop this later. On returning to Lisbon after his voyage to India in the summer of 1499, Vasco da Gama was questioned by Francisco de Portugal, a friend of him. He was Count of Vimioso, who wanted to know, and I quote from, again, a Portuguese document of that period, what goods are available there, I think in India, of course in India, to bring here in Portugal, and what things they would like in exchange. Finding out that Western gold and silver would be needed to obtain Eastern spices, the Count made the following delicious sarcastic observation. In the end, they are the ones who discovered us. Ultimately, the confusion of identities and roles played by each individual or group within the region, well represented in the episode of this Constantino de Sá de Noronha in Sri Lanka, who became a local deity after his death in 1630, underscores the accuracy of the Count of Vimioso's observation about the Portuguese discovery of the Indian Ocean. We cannot say with certainty who discovered whom. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. In the beginning, you mentioned that you saw similarities between these port cities and current port cities, such as Singapore, Hong Kong, and perhaps Abu Dhabi. And I was just wondering if you might elaborate a little bit more on that.
No, thank you. Well, I think, one of the topics that is much discussed with people doing the Indian Ocean studies is to what extent port cities, what kind of relationship port cities have with their interland. One place in Eastern Africa, one of the sultanates in Eastern Africa, perhaps the ones with sort of mixture between Arabic-Persian component and then the Bantu system, which was there previously, have, of course, less to do with African interland areas like nowadays Mozambique up to Angola, of course, in a longer route, than with the Gujarati ports of Diu and Surat and so forth. So one of the ideas that port cities, which usually lack territory or don't make much use of the territory itself, the case of Hormuz, for example, which was of course, one of the crucial port cities in the region and in the Indian Ocean system, world system, didn't have water. And they were importing water from mainland every day. And actually, the Portuguese understood the system. And to conquer the city, they have bombarded the existing cistern so that they could take control of the sea. A place like Malacca was attracting all these merchants. It was really very diverse in terms of commercial communities. Was dependent on rice from Burma, nowadays Burma, by that time Pegu, Lower Pegu, to have food. So this idea that you don't really either care or control your hinterland, and you are much more into the maritime connections that your privileged specific position offers you, I think is one of the things one can consider. If you look at Singapore as one of the most important ports in the world, Hong Kong before the handover, I think, is also a good example of that. The 1970s, 1980s, very little to do with the outskirts of Hong Kong in mainland China. Today is a different story. So I think Abu Dhabi I know less about, but the desert is there, and I think most probably you will be more connected to other port cities in the region, of course, and on top of that, the addition of airports and things that didn't exist in the 16th century. And also on top of that, this idea of multi-ethnic societies with, of course, violence, social control over people, but in places like Malacca, again, they were very lenient in that sense. Perhaps places like Singapore are less lenient today in terms of that kind of freedom, but it's amazing how different European societies describe some of these sultanates. And of course, they were biased at the beginning, as Muslim ports. And once they got to these places, they were actually impressed by the ethnic variety and the ways in which different societies were well treated from a commercial, political, and social point of view. So as I said in the beginning, not that there's a sort of copycat equation here, and I wouldn't say that all the things that one can consider and identify for 16th, 17th century port cities are present in some of the examples I gave. But again, I think the lack of territory or not use of the hinterland and the way these places foster outside connections as more important than the continental ones, I think it's something to bear in mind. Thank you for the question.
The Straits of Hormuz
Yes.
are obviously very close to where we are here. So could you say a bit more about the trading centres closer to here and the artwork in Hormuz that you mentioned? Where exactly was that from?
The
artwork.
The artwork.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, okay. The Portuguese thought of Hormuz as the place to control the entrance of the Persian Gulf, and then a number of satellite ports that they tried to control. And some of them actually they maintained after the loss of Hormuz to the Safavids in 1622. So this is, for them, Hormuz was crucial in the beginning as the place where they got Arabian horses to get them into Goa, to put them inside the continental Indian subcontinent, and then to foster wars and military conflicts, different military conflicts in the Deccan Sultanates who could not breed horses. And you see that it's actually part of the so-called country trade, or as the Portuguese government was noting in the 1510s, trade from India to India. Say, if we do this, it's better than thinking of sending spices and resorting on the trade fully resort on trades in spices from Goa to Lisbon. It's something that we should complement with other kinds of regional trading networks, like, for example, textiles from Gujarat to get ivory and gold from Mozambique, for example, from these Eastern African sultanates that I mentioned. The thing is that the Portuguese also had access to other, which is not equally important in terms of money and volume of trade. But once you dig the Portuguese documents, you see that, for example, cultured viceroys, like sort of humanist figure of Portuguese history of the mid-16th century, a man called Dom João de Castro, who was governor of India in the 1540s, was taking advantage of the Portuguese trading agents in Hormuz to get illuminated manuscripts, for example. So there's a sort of luxury trade, which, of course, is sought after and fostered by the political and intellectual elites of the so-called Portuguese state of India, who take advantage of Portuguese control, commercial control of some of these areas to get into rich commodities, elite commodities, symbolic commodities that they want to have access to. And so I would say that perhaps this guy, Dom João de Castro, was one of the first people in Portugal, in Europe, but perhaps in Portugal the first one, to have a sort of Oriental library, taking advantage of his political influence, of his political position, to get these illuminated manuscripts from Hormuz. For example, one of them being the story of Alexander is one of them that he was mentioning and wanted to have in his collection. So there's always this sort of, I would say, this balance between the massive trade on spices, on horses, on rice, whatever, together with the individual interests of people, either the top elite as this viceroy of Portugal, but also lower people, lower socially, in the social scale, lower people, who, when you go through their wills when they die, either in Portugal or in Asia, you see the massive amount of Oriental commodities that they had, and still they were not rich people. So you see there's a sort of high and low access. It's a very diffused, I would say, very, very widespread access to Asian commodities by the Portuguese officials, even by these renegades, these adventurers who had access to that in different parts of maritime Asia.
I'm curious about the Portuguese bringing certain plants from Brazil over to India, and then from India over to Brazil, like the jackfruit and rubber and cashew nuts. And then from India, I think the tamarind and the mangoes over to Brazil.
Yeah.
Also, I've noticed that the words in Kerala for table, chair, window, and let's see. Well, they're very similar to the Portuguese words for the same things. Also, I've noticed that the old houses in Brazil are similar to those in southern India and Sri Lanka, with the same roofing tiles and the clay roofing tiles. Can you comment on all those?
Yeah, actually, this is one of the interesting things about an European empire, in this case the Portuguese one, in terms of circulation of plants, of decoration work, of architectural work, and how they appropriated and they created with local artists, they have created new things, which is in a way of sort of compromise between two different traditions, and how these new forms circulated in different parts of the empire, right? Again, it moves to the importance of circulation, of the oceanic trade, and to the fact that, many of these people, if you follow some of these people who were doing the Portuguese empire, you see that they could be 5 years in India and then move to Brazil. So there's a sort of individual component element on this kind of circulation. And there's a lot of work from the Portuguese side. There's a lot of work there's a book with an English translation called The Adventure of Plants, which shows the kind of interactions you were discussing. Also, art historians doing a lot of work on that, and actually trying also to identify local artisans working with the Portuguese, also in silvercraft, and people, experts on gold work coming to Portugal and presenting their work there in the early 16th century. There are people who are documented at a very early period, the early 16th century, for example. So I would say that you find a certain movement as far as Portuguese historiography is concerned to identify and to work along the lines of the phenomena that you have described. botanical transfer is one thing. Art historians are doing the kind of thing that you have discussed regarding tables and many other types of furniture, and architecture also. And I would say that architects are also important. Doing history of architecture are also important on this. I would say that there's a lot of work either done or in a way financed by a Portuguese foundation, which is the Gulbenkian Foundation. And they have published a lot of work on this, very invested in collaborating with Brazilian institutions. And especially what you said about furniture and architecture is something that you can, if you check their website, Gulbenkian Foundation, you'll find some of the work they have been financing over the years. But it's, I think, a very interesting component of this circulation of phenomena that we were describing. Thank you.
Hi. You talked about the cosmopolitan, varied, tolerant nature of these port cities, but presumably there was dangers as well for maritime travellers. You also touched on the fact that a Portuguese ship might have a very small number of Portuguese sailors and other people on it. So trade's a two-way process. Presumably some of these people got back to Portugal as well. I think of, say, the Spanish port of Cadiz. It's also renowned for being very varied and tolerant. What sort of reception did maritime travellers get in Portugal? And what is the relative hospitality and dangers that would be faced in this two-way traffic?
That's a very interesting question, I think, because it's something that still lacks in the work that Portuguese historians or other historians doing the Portuguese Empire, this sort of connection between what is going on in a place like the Indian, or in different places of the Indian Ocean, or even Brazil, or West Africa, or Morocco, and then once people move back to the metropolis, and what kind of behavior they have, what kind of social interactions, social communities they belong to, family included. And we don't know a lot about this yet. I would say there's an interesting book for the Spanish case. You mentioned Cadiz, and there's a book called New Spain in a Basque Village, where there's someone who was able to identify and actually to work along the lines of the demographical structure of a certain Basque region, a small one. And he came across and realized that a lot of the population there was coming, well, people who have gone to New Spain, to Mexico, and then back. And he discusses the kind of impact this has over the local society. I would say that we don't have a lot of work for the Portuguese case along those lines. But what we know more about is about people who went to Morocco or were caught in the Mediterranean playing with this double identity. You know, one day I'm Christian, another way I can hang out with Jews or with Muslims. And when coming back to Portugal, they have a lot of problems with Inquisition. And we know how, through the Inquisition records, which I think is the best source to deal with the kind of social history that you are implying, we know that they were clearly surveyed and scrutinized and controlled. We know less about other people. Many of these people went to Asia, and I have described as local advisors, the King of Cambodia, and so forth. These people never came back. Many of these people that are documented, Francisco Vieira de Figueiredo in Makassar, he died in East Timor. His wife became the ship owner, one of the most important ship owners in Macau, profiting from his affluence and being a widow of someone like that. And so many of these people stayed on and never came back. So we know less about that. It's easier to do that kind of exercise with people who are close by in Morocco, in this kind of Straits of Gibraltar and so forth. But there are other examples. For example, there's a Portuguese born in Brazil who became a Jesuit missionary in Brazil, early 17th century, late 16th, early 17th century. Then at some point, the Dutch came in 1620, and he decided to become Protestant. He didn't want to be a Catholic Jesuit anymore. He moved to Amsterdam and then to Leiden. He knew Tupi, the language of the Indians in the region. He was schooling the Dutch how to speak Tupi, since they had sort of colony in Brazil between the 1620s and the 1650s. Then he decided at some point, we don't know why, to come to Lisbon, and he was caught by the Inquisition, and then we know the full story about him, right? So the Inquisition is sort of, as a surveillance structure, it's very good for the historians because it gives you the possibility. It's not very interesting, not very healthy to say this, but it's good for the historians because it gives you an idea of what was going on in terms of these people who don't leave track in the documents, in the regular documents many times.
I want to say the development of this empire, this sphere of influence by the Portuguese is very impressive, especially for a small country and in the time period that this all occurred. It begs the question, though, what happened? What eventually happened? What led to the eventual decline of this empire, of this tremendous sphere of influence that Portugal had?
Well, that would be another lecture because it's a long topic, controversial one. You know, that's. I would have to say something about the origins of the empire because people, you know, during Portuguese dictatorship, which came to an end in 1974, and I was in primary school in that period, so I saw the change for the first time. Actually, I remember seeing the portraits of the dictator going out of my classroom, and the new president was a general by then, being depicted there for at least my 5th year, in elementary school, the 4th year. And that was a big change, you know, because, for example, what I said about today about renegades, about adventurers, about so-called informal empire, is something that people wouldn't talk about until the 1970s, 1980s. Because you wouldn't say for a very nationalist country with a dictatorship, very proud, and using the Portuguese empire as a political tool and as a diplomatic tool, to say that you had people who changed religion is something that you couldn't say. So this became more important, this kind of social work that we were discussing before, became more social history work, became more important in the 1980s, 1990s. And then also a lot of people did a lot of work on the origins of the Portuguese Empire, which was presented as a sort of predestined plan. You know, Prince Henry knew everything and knew how to go to India since the early 15th century. And today we know that it's a lot of contingency. They thought first about North Africa. They didn't know anything about India. Actually, Prince Henry was more keen on staying in the Straits of Gibraltar because of piracy than really exploring the sea. So this is against all the myths of a sort of victorious Portuguese empire. And the problem of decadence is also something that for many years the official historians had to avoid. You know, I remember seeing fictitious maps in my elementary school saying Portugal is not a small country. It starts in Minho. Minho is the northern province of Portugal, and it ends in East Timor, which is far. So you look at the map and you would see the map of Europe actually totally controlled by Portugal, because Russia would be Indonesia, for example, you know. So this kind of political maps with a strong symbolic meaning. And this was presented to kids in elementary school. So the question of decadence is something that people would avoid and independent historians couldn't talk about. We know more about the decadence. You know, there's a number of factors. Demographical factors is one of them. You know, it's in the early 16th century you have 1.5 million Portuguese, and in one century between 1415 and 1543, when the Portuguese got to Japan, you have the Portuguese everywhere, from northern Africa to West Africa to Brazil, and then all parts of the Indian Ocean that we have been discussing. And in many of these places actually, or some of these places, develop as territorial colonies like Brazil. So it's really difficult from a demographical point of view to control this. Also, the effect of other European interventors like the Dutch and the British is something also to consider, very strong element of this story. But I would also avoid a sort of Eurocentric explanation of decadence by layers. You know, as the 16th century as the Portuguese century, the Dutch is the 17th, the 18th century is the British, as if there were no Asian traders or no Asian political and military powers. A lot of the Portuguese drawbacks were coming from a conjunction of people, networks, military, commercial networks against the Portuguese, who evolved over time. You know? The Portuguese lost of Hormuz because Shah Abbas at some point was interested in controlling the Persian Gulf. The Portuguese lost Malacca because the Dutch were interested in that, but also because the Dutch had a local collaborator, sort of local political power, a sultanate called Johor, who helped them getting Malacca. So there's a number to neglect, to disregard the importance and the rise of political, commercial, military entities within the Indian Ocean Sea. It's something that one shouldn't do, and not tell this as a sort of European succession of layers of control from the Portuguese to the British. So I would say, to wrap up, there's a lot of elements in this, from the fragility of the Portuguese, which, you know, it is impressive in many ways, but if you read Portuguese poetry of the 16th century, Portuguese literature of the 16th century, there are a lot of people against the empire saying, you know, we want, if these people go to all these places, one day no one will live here. And so that's the kind of balance that you need to keep up. And not everyone was really into the empire. And the same thing holds true for the Spanish Empire also. There's a lot of people against once you have setbacks in different parts of the Spanish Empire, you have people reminding Philip II, you know, you shouldn't do this. This is Castile, you should stay here. Or you have in the Portuguese Empire saying, the nobles saying, that's fine, we'll do the holy war in Morocco. But I'm not going to Brazil because Brazil is nothing. It has Indians and it's trade and sugar, and I was trained as a noble. I don't care about sugar. So there's a number of different social components within an empire who can contribute to implode it in a way, apart from the external factors.